I would say a lot of our more traditional sheep areas have experienced a really good year. There's been some parts that would have had wetter than they would have liked, but overall it's been a really good year. On average, our pasture-based figures showed that we've grown about 850 kilos more grass than the 5-year average.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Now in this week's episode, we're joined by Grass10 Advisor Nikki Kennedy to explore some key grazing management tips for the weeks ahead. As season draws to a close, we discuss closing targets and best practice for managing and forage crops. We also look at reviewing grazing performance on your own farm this year and identifying areas for improvement and what could be considered. We also look at some of the key investments that could be made to boost productivity for the year ahead. Probably no harm we're wrapping up the grazing season one way, Nikki, because conditions at the moment have been quite challenging.
Yeah, so just a quick roundup. November was very wet for the majority of the country. I'd say no one really got away with a dry November, and that's sort of continuing into December now. Our average cover across dry stock farms from the pasture-based figures is about 760 kilograms of dry matter, so we're looking good from that perspective, but dry matters are really low. Growth, although it's probably better than the 5-year average, it's still pretty low at about 8 kilos of dry matter a day. So grazing now is going to really drop that overall cover just between having to eat more grass because of the low dry matter, but also utilisation is fairly poor in these wet conditions.
Utilisation has to be challenging, and look, it's not even its grazing time's going to be limited on some days, but yeah, conditions have really declined. If we're talking a little bit there about meeting demand at the moment, probably a little bit challenging there too, Nikki, in terms of them physically being able to consume enough without burning off condition.
Yeah, definitely. Between the low dry matters, that means they're going to have to take in more mouthfuls of grass. And when we're seeing conditions bad, lots of wet, waterlogged fields, they spend most of the day walking up and down trying to get that fill. So it's not very conducive to conserving energy and meeting their demands.
Look, when we're talking just about meeting demands and where we should be at the moment, I suppose we have to just remind ourselves of that closing plan and to avoid the temptation, Nikki, of going back in on previously closed up ground. Yeah,
definitely. We definitely want to avoid the regrazing of closed paddocks. We're heading for mid-December now, so we're really looking on a sort of mid-March lambing to have it 80% grazed. At least a lot of people will be ahead of that, and that's fine. People lambing earlier in February, even late January, they really should be finished grazing anything that's intended for the spring. People should have sheep either housed or moved off the spring platform, either onto winter grazing or onto even, say, cover crops.
And Nikki, I suppose when you're talking about closing up, I suppose our closing target, to know we're kind of on track, where do we need to be for well enough stock farms at the moment?
Yeah, I'd be looking if you closed around the 600 or 700, if you're lambing earlier. Down at 600 is probably fine if you are lambing later in March or even into April, you're looking okay. But there's a balance between reaching that closing cover and also reaching the closing cover in good conditions. There's no point absolutely destroying the ground now just to eat off one more field.
No, it's the balancing act too, and I suppose quality comes in it after you too high a cover, but it gives a nice benchmark to where you should be at.
Yeah, definitely. And all of these closing covers are just going towards reaching opening cover targets. We want to go out in the spring with a good cover. Ideally around 700 or 800 should get most people through. And that's just one for nutrition of the sheep. The requirements in the spring are going to be 2.5 to 3 times what they are currently. So it's getting that nutrition into them, which from a performance perspective is vital. But also, if you need to supplementing now whilst it's a dry ewe is so much easier than in the spring when you have lambs and all sorts of other management factors to consider.
No, 100% far easier to meet that demand. And look, we were talking about cover crops there. It's also been challenging getting good utilisation of some of them forage crops. Any tips around how to improve that in the kind of conditions we have at the moment?
Yeah, like with anything, the bad wet conditions make it challenging. It's not what a lot of people want to hear, but we will have to move them into smaller areas more frequently. It's going to stop the tracking across crops, and it will increase our utilisation. It'll mean the same crop will go further. But in saying that, we do have to be careful if we get frosty weather, which we haven't got too much of yet, but we know we're likely to get into that in December and January. Have to be really careful if there is a frost on the crop to wait until that frost is gone mid-morning, hopefully, and move them on, because there is a risk of a bit of nitrite poisoning there when those plants go into stress mode from the frost. But as soon as they're defrosted, you're safe to move on and give them that fresh break.
And of course, that fresh allocation is going to start eating straight away. So look, that's just a practical thing you have to be aware of. So we kind of talked about the grazing and the closing targets and advice on that. I suppose it's a stage of the season where we can kind of look back at the year that's been. Overall, Nikki, it's safe to say like it has been a good grazing year. What are pasture-based figures showing?
I would say a lot of our more traditional sheep areas have experienced a really good year. There's been some parts that would have had wetter than they would have liked, but overall it's been a really good year. On average, our pasture-based figures showed that we've grown about 850 kilos more grass than the 5-year average. So we're nearly getting a full rotation extra in. So that's really good. We've seen that across the condition of lambs and ewes this year has been really good going into the back end.
Yeah, like certainly that extra graze, I think it was felt on most farms. So look, overall a good year, but I suppose even on a good year, Nikki, on every farm, regardless of how well it's performing, there are fields there that to an extent outperform, but there are others that will also lag behind. And I suppose if we're talking about in terms of livestock, you'd be talking about culling them. So what's the culling version for fields that haven't grown well this year or that we haven't got a lot of grazings out of?
Yeah, like everything, there's always poor performers, and if we can sort of lift that bottom of anything, like you say, whether it's livestock or our farm. So I would say look at your paddocks and try and assess which paddocks didn't perform, whether that's by how many times you grazed it, if you're recording that on pasture base, or even if you take a note of every time you leave a paddock, you'll get a good sort of assessment of how many times you're grazing it and maybe for how long. You might graze at the same time as the paddock next door, which is the same size, but if you're getting a day less every time, you're really not getting that much performance out of it. So once you have that, those sort of lower performing paddocks identified, it's a real opportunity to look at what needs to be done. If it's really old pasture, you might be looking at reseeding, especially after a couple of good years. We might have the funds there to go into reseed. But alternatively, it might just be looking at corrective measures on soil fertility. That could be lime, that could be P's and K's, or a combination of both.
Look, you touched on something else that is very relevant. Look, it's a stage of the year where we can think about what do we need to buy, what investments you need to make. And you touched on two things there. Budgeting for reseeding in areas next year, and certainly looking at your soil fertility are probably two of the key ones to look at. Are there any others we should be kind of considering?
Yeah, I'd say grazing infrastructure, and a lot of people would get hung up on grazing infrastructure being big roadways through farms, and that is one bit of infrastructure, but it's not the be all and end all. Not all infrastructure investments are as big as that. It could be as simple as things like identifying a paddock that you might want to split in two to get better utilisation out of it, but the trough is in the corner. Simple things like moving the trough into the middle of the field to enable that field to be split and access to water the whole time. Like you're looking at probably €1.50 a metre for pipe just to move that and a couple of extra fittings. It could make a big difference in how much grass you're growing. On that as well, you're going to need your fences. So whether that be permanent fences or electric fences, take stock of what fences you have, what reels you have. Is the wire doing a good job? Is it carrying your current well, or do they need to be replaced? Better to do all of this now whilst there's time and there's no stock pressure on it than when you're in spring and you find out when lambs are getting through the fence.
Oh, and look, it's important. We were chatting a second ago about fields performing or not performing, and what you just mentioned there, the basic infrastructure, splitting the paddocks off. We talk about the grazing, but it's the ability to rest them after grazing. can have a big impact on the total production. And it's not a major investment, Nikki, in terms of outlay, but it can have a huge and immediate impact on the return you get from it.
Yeah, definitely. The return on letting a field rest, I think everyone's seen it. If you let it rest and you see it green up and it comes back better, it not only definitely grows more grass, but the quality of grass. So the performance you're getting off those fields is just massive. And like I said, that can be simple. Just splitting a couple of paddocks in two gives you that rest. Even simple things like, I'm guilty of it myself. You go out and put out ewes and lambs in the spring, and next minute the lambs are all under the gate because the soil's been sort of eroded away over the winter with puddles and whatnot. So going out and checking those gates and just either dropping the gate or filling in below it, it can have a massive effect on your sort of pasture management, because stock is going to stay where you put it and you're not sort of forced into maybe matching up groups that you didn't intend to.
I suppose that's the short-term stuff, Nikki. Probably the other thing we need to get on the cards, you mentioned there about soil fertility and number terms, is something we need to think about as we come into the new year.
Yeah, definitely. Plan to sample. Like it's often people have the thought of doing it and then the time comes to it in January or maybe early February and you haven't had a plan in place, and then suddenly lambing is upon you. So plan now to sample. It needs to be 6 to 8 weeks after any fertiliser is gone out or slurry, which will be safe come that time of year. So just plan to sample, because there's so much you can get out of knowing that.
No problem. Nikki, look, great having you on. Certainly there's bits of that. We'll definitely come back in January. Good way to wrap up the grazing year, and we'll chat to you in a couple of weeks.
Cheers, Kieran.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. I have included a link in the show notes to the Grass10 newsletter where you can get weekly updates on the programme and host of useful information. That's it for me. For updates on our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.